You know that feeling when you say something completely reasonable, and somehow the other person just looks at you like you said something wrong? Like you're speaking a different language entirely? You replay the conversation in your head later, wondering what just happened. That feeling, that confusion, that quiet frustration, it follows you around more than you'd like to admit. And here's the thing, it's not because you're not smart, it's not because you don't have good ideas, it's not because you're difficult or hard to be around, it's because nobody ever taught you the specific language patterns that make people actually hear you. There's a massive difference between saying words and being understood. Most people go their entire lives never knowing that difference even exists. In the next few minutes, something is going to shift for you. Stick with me on this. I want you to think about the last time you felt genuinely misunderstood. Maybe it was at work, maybe it was at home, maybe it was with someone you really care about. You said what you meant, you were being sincere, and somehow it landed completely wrong. The other person got defensive, or dismissive, or they just didn't get it, and you walked away feeling a little smaller than before, a little less confident, a little more unsure about whether you should even bother trying to express yourself next time. That's what misunderstanding does over time. It doesn't just affect one conversation. It chips away at you, slowly, quietly, until you start holding back. You edit yourself before you even speak. You second-guess every word before it leaves your mouth. You start to wonder if maybe the problem is just you. It isn't. The problem is the language. And language can be changed. Now before we go further, if you already know this about yourself, if you've been feeling this for a while, there is a program linked down below in the video description that goes much deeper into these exact communication shifts. People who genuinely needed real change in how they communicate have used it and seen results faster than they expected. If you feel like you've been stuck in this pattern longer than you should have been, check it out sooner rather than later. The longer you wait, the longer everything stays exactly the same. But right now, let's talk about what's actually happening in these conversations, and why such small changes make such a dramatic difference. Here's the first thing most people never realize. The words you choose tell the other person how to feel about you before your actual message even lands. Think about that. Before someone processes what you're saying, they're already forming an emotional response to how you're saying it. That response determines whether they're open to you or closed off before the sentence is even finished. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine two people giving the same feedback to a colleague about a project. The first person says, "This doesn't work, it needs to be redone." The second person says, "There's something really interesting here, and I think there's a way to make it land even harder." Same concern, completely different emotional experience for the person receiving it. One of them is going to be trusted, respected, and listened to. The other one is going to be resented and avoided. The difference isn't the intention behind the words. The difference is the words themselves. That's not a small thing. That's everything. Now here's where it gets personal. Think about how many relationships in your life have been quietly damaged, not because of what you meant, but because of how it came across. Friendships where there's this invisible wall now. Professional relationships where you can feel that you're not quite being taken seriously. Romantic relationships where the same argument keeps happening over and over and you can never quite figure out why. That invisible wall isn't built from bad intentions. It's built from language patterns that signal the wrong thing. And the most painful part? You can feel it happening, but you can't stop it. You can sense that something is off in the room, that the energy shifted, that you said something that landed wrong but you don't know what it was or how to fix it. So you either overcorrect and say too much, or you shut down completely. Neither one works. Researchers who study human communication have found something remarkable. The actual content of what we say, the information, the facts, the argument, accounts for a surprisingly small percentage of how people experience a conversation. The rest is tone, word choice, pacing, and framing. That means that you could be completely right about something and still lose the room entirely just because of how you framed it. You could have the best idea in a meeting and watch someone else get the credit for a slightly worse version of it, simply because they knew how to frame it better. This happens constantly. To smart, capable, thoughtful people. Every single day. So what actually changes things? Let's go into the real mechanics here. The first shift is moving from statements to invitations. When you state something directly, especially something the other person might not be ready to hear, you trigger their defenses automatically. Their brain perceives it as a challenge, even if you meant it as information. But when you frame the same thing as something to consider together, something you're curious about, something you're exploring rather than declaring, the defensiveness drops. They feel included rather than confronted. And once someone feels included, they become open. And once someone is open, they can actually hear you. The second shift is about ownership language. There's a pattern that people who are consistently respected use that most people never consciously notice. They take ownership of their perspective rather than presenting their views as universal truths. Instead of saying that's wrong or that doesn't make sense, they say the way I'm seeing it, or from where I'm standing. This seems tiny. It is not tiny. It completely changes the dynamic because suddenly you're not in a debate. You're in an exchange, and in an exchange, people stay. In a debate, people dig in and stop listening. And here's the fascinating part. When you stop trying to win and start trying to connect, you actually end up being far more persuasive. The irony is almost painful. The more you fight to be understood, the less you're understood. The moment you release that grip and speak from a place of curiosity and invitation, people lean in. The third shift is what happens in moments of conflict. This is where everything tends to fall apart for most people. Someone says something that feels like an attack or a dismissal or a criticism, and the automatic response is either to defend, to withdraw, or to escalate. None of those work. All three of them make the situation worse in different ways. The language pattern that actually works in those moments is what you might call a tension dissolve. It sounds like this. Help me understand what you mean by that. 5 words. That's it. Those 5 words do something almost miraculous. They stop the emotional escalation. They signal that you're genuinely trying to understand rather than fighting. And they hand the other person a sense of being valued in the middle of what was starting to feel like conflict. People who use this pattern consistently are described by others as remarkably easy to talk to, mature, grounded, and trustworthy. And they didn't change who they are. They changed 5 words. Now let's talk about what happens when you start applying these shifts consistently, because this is where the story gets good. People who have gone through the process of genuinely rebuilding their communication from the ground up report something unexpected. It isn't just that their conversations improve, it's that their entire social experience transforms. They start being invited into opportunities they weren't invited into before. They get asked for their input in rooms where they used to be invisible. People start saying things like, "I always feel better after talking to you," or "There's something about you that's really easy to trust." These are not small things. These are the things that determine whether someone gets promoted or overlooked, whether relationships deepen or stay surface level, whether someone walks through life feeling seen or feeling like a ghost. The compound effect of being consistently understood is enormous. Within weeks of applying these shifts, people report that their confidence in speaking up goes up dramatically because they're no longer bracing for the conversation to go wrong. They're no longer editing themselves into silence. They say what they mean, they say it well, and it lands the way they intended. And that experience of being heard, really heard, does something to a person. It gives them back something they didn't even know they'd lost. One of the most striking patterns that comes up repeatedly is how quickly professional situations shift. Someone who had been in the same position for years with no movement suddenly finds doors opening. Not because their skills changed, not because the company changed, but because the way they communicate with leadership changed. Decision makers started perceiving them differently. They became someone who commands respect in a room, not because they're louder or more aggressive, but because every time they speak it lands with clarity and intention. That gets noticed. Every time. Here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. How much has staying in the old pattern already cost you? Think about that honestly. The promotion that went to someone else, the relationship that cooled off and you never quite knew why. The moment in that meeting where you had something valuable to say and you held it back because you weren't sure it would land right. Add all of that up. The cost of not changing this isn't abstract. It's real, and it's been accumulating. Now think about what shifts when that pattern breaks. What becomes possible? What conversations can you finally have? What version of yourself shows up when you're not constantly bracing for misunderstanding? That version is not a fantasy. It's the actual result of learning the right language patterns and practicing them until they become natural. Everything we've covered today is the surface of something much deeper. The real work, the transformation that actually changes how you move through the world, that's what the program in the description is built for. This is not for people who are just casually curious. This is for someone who looked at their life honestly today and felt something. Someone who knows that staying exactly where they are is not acceptable anymore. If that's you, don't let this moment pass. The version of you that speaks with confidence, earns respect automatically, and finally feels understood in the conversations that matter most. That version is waiting on the other side of a decision you can make right now,